This is a dark moment. This is the story of the depth of human evil. This is the story of the power of empire and repression. The moment that justice falters, that violence escalates. This is the valley of the shadow of death. I think that sometimes we flinch away from the brutal details of this passage. We're inclined to skip right from Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem, directly to his resurrection and his victory over death. We're inclined to not wade through the murkiness of Jesus' death on the cross. We don't want to think over much about how a man who was proclaimed to be the Savior could die like a common criminal. We don't like to think about the depths of human greed and the lengths that we will go to maintain our power. But without the grief and the death of the passion narrative, we cannot get to the life of the resurrection. Without the passion, our faith remains naive and irrelevant. Because after all, our world is not simply a world of happiness and victory and justice. Our world is a world of brutal realities and painful truths. If our faith cannot speak to both the good and the bad, then it can become irrelevant. The inner truth of this passage has to do with power and empire. It is a truth that we should listen to very carefully as Americans. America represents a mighty world power, not so unlike the Roman Empire in this story. The truth of Jesus' death on the cross should convict us deeply. There are several characters in this story and several important groups of people, and for the sake of understanding this narrative fully, I will go through and describe each of those characters. First, there is Pilate. He is the Roman governor who represents the Roman imperial power. The Roman Empire has conquered the Jewish people, and they are an occupied country. Rebellions are quashed with military force and swift brutality. Second, there are the Jewish authorities, the chief priests and scribes. Their loyalty has been bought by the Roman Empire. In exchange for helping keep the peace and maintain Roman control, they are awarded many luxuries and power by the empire. Third, there is Barabbas, the man who was released in Jesus' place. He is by most accounts a Jewish radical. He was the leader of a violent Jewish resistance against the Roman Empire, an insurrection. Fourth, there is the crowd, or the mob. This is made up of followers of Jesus, his disciples who out of fear deny him, and also those Jewish citizens of Jerusalem who have gathered in the city to celebrate Passover. This is a politically as well as spiritually charged moment. Passover is the celebration of the Jewish escape from slavery in Egypt. During this time, the Roman Empire would have been particularly fearful that the Jewish people would revolt against the occupation. The fifth main character in this moment is Jesus. Jesus is a radical. He has widespread popularity, and his teachings are not just spiritual in nature, they are also political. He's teaching people a path of nonviolent resistance, a path that puts God and love to the forefront. He's teaching people that their loyalty should not be to the Roman Empire, it should be to God. The Roman authorities and the Jewish priests who were allied to the Romans would have seen Jesus as a threat, most likely an even greater threat than the violent Jewish resistance. After all, the Roman Empire has a huge army at its disposal. When met with armed, violent resistance, it can easily match and quash any show of military might. But nonviolence, the way of love, is a much more difficult thing to suppress. If the Jewish people were to take arms against the Roman Empire could simply march in an army and slaughter them. But what Jesus is teaching the Jewish people to do is to resist nonviolently. And that nonviolent resistance is much, much more difficult to suppress. Jesus is arrested and brought before Pilate for a mock trial. It's a travesty of justice. But then there's no real justice in a system where the wealthy and powerful hold all the cards. Jesus answers the questions put to him with quiet dignity. I love when he responds, "You say I am," to Pilate. Pilate perhaps fears a violent uprising will ensue if he crucifies Jesus, and he presents him to the crowd and asks if they wish Jesus to be killed. The chief priests, those who have sold their loyalty to the Roman Empire, they incite the crowd, the mob, to call for Jesus' death. Jesus is brought to the place of crucifixion and is publicly executed. The female disciples stand vigil over him, watching as he slowly dies. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified 2 bandits, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by mocked him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves, saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also taunted him. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is a deeply painful moment. Where can we see ourselves in this story? Personally, I think the story of Jesus' death has a familiar ring to it, and not simply because we have heard this story many times before. I think of others who resisted oppression: Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Archbishop Oscar Romero, and countless others who were killed so that the rich and powerful could continue to hold their power at the expense of others. James Cone reminds us in his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, that Jesus' death at the hands of the Romans is not so different from the death of countless black men and women and even children at the hands of whites. He reminds us that Jesus hanging from the cross bears a striking resemblance to a black man hanging from a tree, or frankly, the body of a black man shot and left lying in the street for hours. I fear that if we are honest when we read ourselves into this story, it is deeply convicting. In some ways, as I have mentioned before, as Americans, we are not entirely dissimilar to the Roman Empire with its vast military power and seemingly endless wealth. We are also not dissimilar to the Jewish priests who fear radical movements, and who will stop at nothing to maintain their comfortable lifestyle. We are not so dissimilar to the mob who acts out of fear. Some of the mob do not know Jesus, and so they act out of fear of the stranger. Some of the mob who do know Jesus act out of fear of change. They fear what will happen to them if they resist the powers of empire. They fear for what the future might hold if they walk a new path. Perhaps in a slightly more positive light, we might imagine ourselves in the place of the faithful women, the women who stood and watched as Jesus died. I believe that they watched out of a sense of solidarity, and also because they didn't want him to be alone when he drew his last breath. They unflinchingly look into the face of evil. All the male disciples are elsewhere, but the women are not afraid to look death in the face. The conclusion to this story, the promise, the hope, the transformation, comes next week on Easter. We're left today with the uncomfortable reality of death and repression. Let us be like the women who watched Jesus die. Let us not look away. Let us sit with the uncomfortable truth of this passage. Let us sit with the uncomfortable truth that those who fight for justice, those who stand for love and nonviolence, are killed every day in our world. Every day. Let us sit and not flinch away from the darkness of this truth. Let us sit with the uncertainty of life, with the murky questions of faith, with the unknown and the uncomfortable. Let us allow this moment to be what it is.